Well, very good afternoon, friends. This is Ravi Verma. I work with the International Center for Research on Women, and I'm happy to moderate this afternoon's webinar Learning Labs from Strive on reframing men and boys in policy for gender equality. This will be presented by Yerker. Yerker is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies and has worked for many years on the issues of gender, masculinities, and structural violence. He has worked on issues of HIV prevention, sexual health, children affected by AIDS, civil society support, and international health. I'm really pleased that he agreed to make this presentation. He has recently directed the consortium called Engendering Men, Evidence on Roads to Gender Equality, Emerge, which was a 2-year program with the IDS in partnership with Promundo and Sonke and Bridge, which is part of the IDS. And it did document best practices and looked into a lot of evidence on how to engage men, what does it, and how to address the issues of masculinity, what does the evidence suggest. I had the privilege of being associated with this consortium as part of the expert advisory group. There were 10 of us, people like Michael Flood and Andrea Cornwall, and had the opportunity to review some of the exciting and very insightful products that have come out of this consortium. So I'm very pleased once again to have Yerker present and talk about the issues of reframing men and boys in policy for gender equality, something that we all care about and we think that know more from the evidence and experiences. So thank you very much once again and welcome. Yerker, can you please take on?
I'm presenting basically findings from a 2-year project funded by DFID that was called Emerge, Engendering Men, Evidence on Routes to Gender Equality. And it is the findings that with the guidance in terms of policy recommendations and how to frame work with men and boys in terms of policy and action on gender equality. And kind of focusing on the understanding of transformation of gender norms in dynamic and structural contexts, which we felt was quite relevant to Strive, obviously focusing on the structural drivers of HIV in the case of Strive. So I'm Yerker Edström. I'm leader of the Gender and Sexuality cluster at IDS. As I mentioned, the project Emerge was funded by DFID over 2 years, and it's implemented by a consortium of IDS, Institute of Development Studies, together with Promundo US and Sonke Gender Justice. And it builds essentially on earlier work that we have done with partners, often funded by CEDA, and engagements with different people from a seminar symposium back in 2007 called Politicizing Masculinities to work on a project called Mobilizing Men across 3 countries. And recently we had a symposium coming out of a program on gender, power, and sexuality that focused on undressing patriarchy. So it has a trajectory in terms of the work. But over the period of 2014 to 2016, we worked in 3 phases, starting with a review of the evidence, resulting in a major 165-page evidence review on working with men and boys across 9 different themes. There's a 4-page summary, evidence summary to go with that. And then that phase was followed by documenting examples of good practice through 8 case studies across 8 different settings, and that was also accompanied by not just case studies, but 4-page stories of change to go with those. And then the final phase, most recently, was producing a set of resources, including a conceptual guidance paper on which this presentation is based, 2 briefs on lessons in good practice for work with men and boys, and a second brief on reframing men and boys in policy for gender equality, more directed at policymakers, and as well as a collection of online resources like toolkits and guides and so on, which is all available at our website, menandboys.ids.ac.uk. The next slide shows here what the website looks like when you arrive at it. It's organized into the different phases, and there's 3 different phases, if you like, and 9 themes. You see the little game board at the side of the website homepage reflects the 9 different themes. So you can pick a particular theme, like in the middle, for example, there's a condom, icon of a condom, and that's the sexual reproductive health and rights theme. And if you click on that, you get onto a page on that theme that links you to the evidence review, as well as to case studies, as well as to stories of change. So let me ask the obvious question: what's the problem in terms of working with men and boys in gender work? It might sound obvious to some, but in policy circles, it doesn't appear so obvious always. The first challenge is that men and boys are often visible in gender policy frameworks and theories of change. And that's despite the fact that in gender work in the 80s and 90s, we started to see gender as relational and structural, as well as affecting individuals. Yet in the last decades, we've kind of slid back to theories of change that which focus almost exclusively on women and girls. And the roles that men and boys can play in challenging gender relations are often not recognized as a result. So where men and boys or masculinity do appear, they tend to be framed only as barriers of change to gender, or barriers to gender equality. The next slide here is an image of DFID's strategic vision for women and girls, or girls and women rather. And it's focused on voice, choice, and control of women and girls. The red arrow at the bottom shows you where men and boys appear in this framework, which is quite typical of current theories of change. Basically, men and boys appear as elements of enabling or disabling environments, as obstacles to gender change. So second challenge is that change towards equality is often seen in very linear cause and effect ways, and various frameworks that focus on tackling barriers to change and barriers to progress head on, but they often don't factor in alternative routes or build on positive changes. So by leaving males as implicit or problematic barriers to gender equality, opportunities to engage different men and boys as different change agents are lost, essentially. Viewing change as linear pathways from an intervention addressing a barrier to positive outcomes can easily result in creation of different silos. We work in different silos on sexual health, on violence, on childcare, economic empowerment, and so on. This, of course, limits the potential for strategically engaging men and boys across the different areas of work around gender. Thirdly, change is often conceptualized without recognition of broader shifts in social societies and institutions. Theories often don't recognize the ways that broader changes in society impact on gender equality strategies and outcomes, often more so than actual programs do. So, for example, young, urban, and educated men may live by increasingly progressive beliefs about gender equality. We know that. But it's essential to also factor in concurrent trends of patriarchal backlash, urban unemployment, and crisis of masculinity for some underemployed male youth. So leaving multiple complex and shifting roles of men invisible in policy frameworks and strategies means that those strategies remain vulnerable to the winds of fortune as trends essentially change the reality in which we're working. Examples being new kinds of forms of modernizing misogynies, which are co-opted into rising fundamentalisms, both politically in Europe or in the Middle East and other places, whether they're religious or more political. How do we then reframe men and boys in work with, on gender equality? The first point is that gender is relational and socially constructed. Gender equality goals and strategies need to be reframed in relational terms rather than just being about women and girls. Initiatives need to address power relations between women and men rather than working with women and girls, or indeed men and boys, in isolation. That doesn't mean that everybody's needs need to be met with equal urgency. It's rather taking an approach, a relational approach that may also involve divesting some men of their unearned privileges. For example, there's a case study in the Emerge collection from Latin America, which has highlighted the importance of working with men and boys to increase their recognitions of women's unpaid care role, and for men to engage more actively in redistributing that work, both in the home and more socially. So the second point is that gender is intersectional. We need to understand gender as operating along with other inequalities of power based on class, race, and sexuality or ability, age, and so on. So making the links increases the opportunities for men to work more effectively with women for gender equality, as it's framed in a broader notion of social justice. So, and basing it on shared interests and solidarities as well as specific ones. An example would be a case study from Emerge from Bangladesh, which demonstrated how the social movement ICRW-ARO works with male and female landless rights group members to understand the ways that gender and class hierarchies work together in their sort of oppression and disempowerment. It's increased the solidarity between women and men as a result, and it's built a shared commitment to addressing gender inequalities alongside economic inequalities for them and social inequalities. This is a picture of ICRW-ARO having a community or group meeting making decisions. Another point is that social norms are embedded in institutions. They don't just exist in communities, if you like. And they're also shaped by these external trends. So social norms may influence individuals' behaviors, but it's essential to recognize that those norms are dynamic and reproduced through social, political, and economic institutions. They're not free-floating. So therefore, initiatives that aim to engage men and boys for gender equality need to work across the individual, community, and institutional levels at the same time. They also need to engage men in different positions of power and not stereotype men as unemployed youth or a particular category. We need a diversity of men in different roles. And some of those roles might be oppositional and need to be confronted. So an example here is a case study from Ethiopia where we found how female genital mutilation or cutting, an initiative to address this that was community-owned and engaged religious leaders whilst relating it to policy change at the national level. And the combination of these approaches, if you like, and focusing on the local institutions and the religious institutions as well, were able to generate lasting change at the community level. There's an image of a beneficiary of this KMG programs, that program on FGM essentially. So in terms of the external trends, it's essential to recognize that external trends impact on the gender roles and relations. So international social, economic, and political trends such as migration, urbanization, conflict, and changing labor markets are often much more important than our programs are in terms of changing things on the ground. They shift men's attitudes on gender equality, often for the better, but not always. They shape power relations and ideals of masculinity and how ideas of masculinity essentially evolve. And that can go in either direction or in many directions. So initiatives that engage men and boys need to take account of these kinds of trends and work towards positive change, given that they work in both directions, essentially. An example here is from Egypt, a case study that looked at harassment map and imprint, which are two social movements by youth that came about in the wake of the Arab Spring. And the case study demonstrates the flexibility that these movements had in setting up and in creating and setting up, engaging young women as well as young men, and to challenge the emergence of sexual harassment in public spaces. The movements adapted their strategies quite fluidly for a changing political backdrop and realigned their work to take advantage of new sexual harassment legislation, for example. So it's about being nimble in time with those changes. Here we see some activists, volunteers from imprint security patrols. This point that context is key is obviously not new. We all repeat it as a mantra in our work, but we need to think about this a bit more deeply, and that gender relations differ across societies and are more deeply rooted in structures, histories, and cultures than we often imagine. For example, harmful masculinities need to be understood in context and in terms of different ideals of being men. And efforts to change need to be grounded in local knowledge, priorities, and histories, and they need to be driven by local ownership. This is familiar, but it's worth going over because it is so complex. And the point of the case study that we had in India on the Samjidar, or meaning supportive partner project, it was that the project was shaped within a historical and political context of demands for inclusive governance, including gender quotas and local government representation. And it enabled young men to successfully support women privately and publicly, from working in their homes and on their relationships to working in public and politics, in public life and in politics, supporting women to stand for election and preparing them to get into the local panchayats. Here's a group of men working on the Men for Gender Equality project in this case study in Maharashtra, doing their analysis. So the point about the personal working in public and private space is also that the personal is political and vice versa, and this is also true for men. The changing gender norms and relation is not in all men's interest. We need to recognize that, and many men will resist change. So even men who are open to change may also find it difficult to change in practice. It may involve kind of ongoing, deeply personal challenges. The initiatives to engage men and boys on gender equality need to challenge and both challenge and support men to be accountable for transforming often gender norms, both within their communities, but also in their private lives and in themselves, in their own consciousness and behaviors. Processes to engage men as agents of change in addressing gender equality have been successfully used to work on gender-based violence, for example, in many settings, from Sonke's one-man campaign in South Africa to other places, and the Maswab campaign in Uttar Pradesh of India is a good case in point, where men work on consciousness raising to shift the personal commitments to equality as well as public action with women to challenge systemic gender inequality rather. Here is simply a slide of context that highlights that the private is political, or the personal is political, and that point about the private and the public. One challenge with structural models, ecological structural models, is that you can easily separate the individual from the broader context through layers of relationships, communities, institutions, and so on. It might create the illusion that the personal and private is only at the individual and perhaps the relationship level, whereas the public and political is at the societal level. That's not the case, and these case studies demonstrate that effectively, how the public and private spaces cut across these different dimensions of context. The implications being that interventions need to combine individual work with relational work, community work, and institutional strategies with a political strategy, often rooted in kind of legislation and law as it appears in countries. The other point here is that we have to factor in timescales and how these local contexts change, not just through long-term trends, but also through kind of medium-term trends, intergenerational shifts, and short-term cycles. So we distilled some elements of good practice from all these case studies and from the evidence. I'm not going to go into the details too much, but starting with engaging men and boys on interpersonal issues seems to be very effective to oppose gender inequality. You have to make it personal. It has to be relevant to people's lives. And then there's a second set of strategies. You kind of move on to working strategically and politically at collective and institutional levels. That's much more easy once you've started to sort of raise consciousness and amongst men about their relationships and their own lives. And then thirdly, you need to have a set of kind of strategies to learn and adapt and nurture sustainability of that change. And these cycles, of course, go back as well. The return arrows in this chart aren't visible here, but so what does it mean for policy and changing policy? In this diagram, the six blue boxes are the kind of principles I've covered before in this presentation. Now, policy works at local, national, global levels, and it's kind of enacted through relationships between policymakers, activists, civil society, actors, and researchers, and so on. And if we can change our understanding of gender issues, we can change the narratives and the discourse we use to describe them, which can gradually change policy and practice in small steps. Now that kind of is dynamic, and it interacts, and it involves policymakers in connection to implementers and activists and researchers, and it's a kind of ongoing circular process. So our recommendations is focusing on those principles that are evidence-based and using those to change our understanding and our frameworks, and therefore also our narratives and discourse. And this is the last slide. It's the recommendations coming out of this policy paper, which are 6 key recommendations. First is to reframe policy on gender in relational terms involving both males and females, which imply systematically making visible a greater range of male and female roles and potential contributions. Secondly, it implies resisting using stereotypes or framing people of all genders as potential agents of change, rather than stereotyping them as victims or as perpetrators only, for example. Second recommendation is to recognize that gender is in intersectional terms, rather, in terms of the leaving no one behind agenda. It might imply increasing resources to support work that crosses across issues and beyond, but linked to gender. So it might be economic empowerment or social, economic policy around care issues, or it could be, sexual health policies around how clinics should work on HIV treatment, etc. And linking that to gender and social justice. Second implication is to improve gender mainstreaming in other program support, to focus on the most marginalized women and men, girls and boys, in a sense regardless of gender, but being gender aware and sensitive to gendered power dynamics. So the third recommendation is to enable work with men and boys that links the personal and the political, that facilitates movement building and alliances. And this is quite rare. There are very good examples, and we've seen some good cases of this, but yet policy doesn't speak to recognizing the need for this. The first implication of that is that we need to support critical consciousness raising with men and accountability of duty bearers. Obviously, we're familiar with critical consciousness raising in women's empowerment, but this is relevant in a kind of opposite direction for men as well, which also involves divesting men of their attachment to privilege and supremacy, of course. Second implication here is that we need to support alliance building and institutional level work, not just working to change individual men and boys. Now, the fourth recommendation here is that we need to move on from this kind of short project modality towards longer term and more adaptive approaches. Essentially, we need to support strategies that have longer term perspective and are more adaptive to changing realities. Evaluation frameworks which take a longer term view and frame strategies as contributing to change rather than impact in isolation. And funding also needs to be enabled to process kind of more process-oriented and adaptive theories of change and approaches. And we need to hold men accountable to women's call for gender justice is another recommendation here, which means supporting initiatives with men that essentially engage with the work of women's movements and other social justice movements. We also need to support collaboration between women's movements and men and boys, essentially. The final version of the policy brief has slightly reorganized a couple of those recommendations and actually contains 6 recommendations. But I have to simply apologize for that, but encourage you to visit the website and download the framing paper and the policy brief, and you will have an even more clear and convincing set of recommendations. So that's where the presentation ends, but over to you.
So Jirka, you did a really great job. Thank you very much for this very comprehensive presentation of the eMERGE findings. I wanted to see if you have any example of what does divesting privileges mean for men. You know, are there examples within these case studies that have documented how men see this? Losing out on privileges. What does it mean to them? And if you could reflect on that piece, because it is easily said than done that some of the men would have to give up the privileges. But what does it mean to them?
Yes. Yeah. No. This is a $1 million question. It's a really good question, and there are examples. So let me preface that by saying that, of course, not all. As I said, it isn't in all men's interest to change, and some men will resist and oppose. So there's at least 2 levels, probably many more to this. Intersectionality becomes really important here when issues like caste and class or sexuality or other age issues and so on intersect with gender. So from India, both in I'll speak to India because I've been working most closely on those cases recently. In Maswa and in supportive partners in Maharashtra, they often work with young men to kind of look at their personal relationships and issues that they have with masculinity and their expectations on them and how they experience patriarchal power essentially in the community and in their homes often. Many of the activists are from middle or lower caste. Some are involved in cross-caste relationships or marriages, which in India, of course, raises a lot of issues in their home and the community. So they have a framework of looking at patriarchal oppression that is linked to social justice and oppression more broadly. So they can see benefits to a different gender order and to different ways of being men in the home. Now, this is still at the kind of domestic level. But then, as we've seen both in Uttar Pradesh and in Maharashtra, these men can then go out and work with women in the communities to get, in the case of Maharashtra, getting women into the panchayat, the local government, from lower caste women, or women who are more representative of the community in general, using the reservation system, the quota system, in order to have class-based or caste-based interests represented in government, local government, so divesting male privilege from certain men, in this case, it is elite men from the elite caste who've been controlling the local government for many decades or centuries possibly, or at least decades. I'm not familiar with the deep history of the panchayats, but so in this case, the elite men, most of the elite men will resist. Some may change when they see the benefits of changing. So as you will be familiar with, Ravi, a common phenomena has been that elite men will get their wives elected in the quota system in order to represent them, whereas the elite men take the real decisions. So that's a form of co-option of a progressive law, if you like, to kind of retain patriarchal control. those men have been challenged by the often younger and lower caste men in these communities about, and publicly in the Gram Savna, the village meetings, the village assembly meetings. So this isn't all nice stuff. This is real politics as well. But by connecting the issue of gender injustice to issues of broader social justice, you are able to challenge certain men, hold men to account, and then in public there is a negotiation. And as these communities change, men and women will find their way forward in ways that are hopefully more gender equitable, and that will depend on these broader trends. Of course, we've also seen in India kind of rising trends of nationalisms and the kind of traditional family values movement, which is a very kind of anti-feminist backlash movement. I'm not sure whether that fully answers your question.
It does, Yerker, and it provides a perfect segue into the recommendation that the emerge findings put forward about evaluations to take a longer-term view of the outcomes of engaging men, and these works should be seen as contributing to the change process, and therefore some of these changes are not so visible and perhaps would take a little time to become explicit, and therefore there's a need to take a long-term view, and I think the next body of work should really identify how do we milestone some of these changes to ensure that we are moving in the right direction, the contribution is happening in the right direction. Who is challenging what and where and to what extent need to be documented and need to be factored into the evaluation and research process. So yes, you did provide that insight. So thank you, Yerker. I'm looking forward to the other questions and other comments.
Right. I have a question here from, is it Rujuta Teredesai, who asks, can you please share examples of models or programs that do learn, adapt, and sustain effectively?
That's a very good question. Not an easy one. But programs or approaches, I think I heard you say, but I'm not 100% sure. Part of the question about my clarification is that, okay, so we have different ways of intervening. In one sense, like women's empowerment, these are political projects and sometimes driven forward by movements, essentially, whereas other times we have projects that are funded by government or by donors. Examples. We've seen, I think the Matwa experience, Men's Action to Stop Violence Against Women in Maharashtra, is very interesting and telling. They've used, it's a networking movement approach. It's a campaign that's built on a network of men across different institutions who come through university, then go back to communities, work with local panchayats, with local schools, and so on. And it's evolved over time, over decades. And they've used different donor resources to stitch together their own adaptive approach that's been working over time. Of course, they've been supported by an NGO, Center for Health and Social Justice in Delhi, which undoubtedly has helped to direct that work or sort of influence the direction of that work over time. That's an example of an approach that has adapted and evolved. With funded projects, this is one of the challenges in development and working on HIV. I've worked in HIV in the past for many years, over a decade, is a good example. Projects are short-term or even medium-term projects, rarely extend beyond 3-5 years if you're lucky. I don't know, Strive itself is probably funded for 5 years. And, at the end of that project, you're supposed to wrap up and show your impact, and then the donors move on and you're scrambling around to figure out where to go next. That's a very different way of working. And what we are saying is that we have to acknowledge these two or various ways of working. but try to encourage policy to become more facilitating of a greater mix of approaches in order to allow, and look at where they can look at longer term funding, even if it's at a lower level, of processes that evolve over time, to therefore kind of both learn about adaptation to change and contribution to change, rather than these kind of short-term magic bullet fixes where you're measuring your impact. I'm not sure whether that fully. So examples you asked for, I think it was Rujita. The Maslow example is one good case in point. I think it's difficult to point to specific projects because the project mode is time bound. It's probably more useful and instructive to look at strategies of organizations, networks, and movements. Gender justice, Sonke Gender Justice in South Africa is a good case in point that has evolved over the years and adapted its approach through its learnings. And there are many others. In Nicaragua, the group of men against violence, Grupo de Hombres contra la Violencia, has been working with Puntos de Encuentro and kind of learned and adapted their approach over the years with quite limited financial resources, as I understand it. So there are examples. What's harder is to box that into a project, but our recommendation is to think longer term, think more kind of longer term programmatically in a way that engages with movements and activism and sustainability. And obviously one recommendation for that is for movements and organizations to diversify their funding base and to broaden their horizons and lengthen their horizons in terms of time and contribution and learning. So I think the recommendations are one set of implications for organizations and movements, and another one for donors and policymakers in order to facilitate that kind of longer term engagement. I mean, we see it in the UK with changes in government and if it having to kind of reorganize and think about whether to fund civil society with PPA arrangements or institutes and universities with RPCs and whether how that kind of programming can get, how there can be some kind of continuity in that is one of the challenges. So I'm not 100% sure I've fully answered the question, but there are some examples, and the better examples are more kind of organizational, programmatic, longer term, whereas specific project examples, packaged as projects, is harder.
Thank you, Jirka. I wanted to point out this. We have another 5 minutes, and we have 3 more questions. So let me get started with one, and then we see how, but just to let you know that there are 2 more coming. Francis Winter says, hi, I'm interested in the intersection of age and gender, and particularly if you had any thoughts about the best entry points working with children on gender equality, especially during early adolescence.
Yeah, I mean, this is a key question. A lot of the work on men and boys has tended to be with men, more than boys, but also young men in particular. Generally, the evidence suggests that change in men and in attitudes and so on, and ways of acting and behaving in relationships is more effective with younger men, not surprisingly. I think that stands to reason. The question about younger children, what's clear is that adolescence is a key period to intervene or kind of to engage with young boys as well as girls, and educational settings is a good place for it. One area is to look at fathering, of course, and not just fathering, parenting, I should say, and how kind of parenting becomes more gender sensitive and less, or more gender equitable and less based on essentially violence. If you think about I think about, childcare and violence as violence against children or young people as opposite ends of a spectrum in a way. If you think about child rearing, there are violent ways of doing it, disciplining children versus caring for children. And it's in that kind of culture of child care and rearing that I think we need to sort of get more engaged with gender equality and addressing issues of kind of oppressive norms and then, of course, the institutions are going to matter here too in terms of how schooling happens, how childcare happens. It's a difficult one. I think when you get below adolescence, it's difficult to think of familiar, at least, types of programmatic or movement networking approaches that are relevant. It's clearly much confined to the home and institutions in case of the most vulnerable children. But it's a crucial intersection. There's a broad recognition that work with boys need to get strengthened in the field across the board. That's not helped by, or it may be helped if we can turn that around. The kind of current focus on women and girls. So when we look at sexual abuse or abuse of children, adolescent children, there's a strong focus on adolescent girls at the moment, and this notion of empowering girls to protect themselves. Now that, to me, is quite an unfair notion, given that you're sort of burdening adolescent girls with the responsibility of gender injustice and violence. So these are areas, and in order for us to be able to work better with young men and with boys in particular in this case, we simply need to kind of reframe how we think about gender inequality and how policy frameworks visibilize or invisibilize the relevant actors. Sure, if I've answered Francis Winter's question here around the intersectionality, another point about the intersectionality is about relationships between children and adults. And this, of course, it's a huge area. We need to look at child protection. We need to look at child rearing, social protection, all of these fields, which speaks a bit to the recommendation about cross-issue funding work that crosses different issues like child protection, social protection, and gender, because these things tend to end up in silos.
Thank you, Jirka. We're coming to the end, I am afraid to say. And I don't know how much people can see in their chat box, but we have a couple of suggestions. April Murphy talks about a program in Australia, a government program called Respect, and adds a link there. Rajuta also says, also wants to share the work of Equal Community Foundation, engaging boys aged 12 to 17. And I know that Ravi, for example, at ICRW has done a great deal of work in this area. You can find some information about that on the Strive website and I'm sure on the ICRW website as well. One more question from Marina Danielle, who says, in a project that focuses primarily on men's involvement and awareness raising for improving women's health outcomes, how can we avoid men encroaching onto women's spheres, and how can we prevent, sorry, I'm getting a bit of a skip here, and how can we prevent negative effects on gender relations?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. Marina points to issues of, possibly diluting the focus of what's needed for women's health in this case and so on, and the problem of the most extreme version of this would be patriarchal kind of backlash, not just dominance and encroaching the space, but then distorting the issues. It's a really tricky one in terms of women's health because, like in HIV, you often need very specialized specific services for certain things, as well as making that issue fully mainstreamed and integrated into the overall health system, let's say. The same is true for women's health more broadly. Obviously, sexual and reproductive health and rights, they're specialized, or sexual reproductive health, let's say, there are specialized needs for women and so on. Now, one big issue in this field is that men's health is generally underattended to, and particularly issues around mental health, substance abuse, and those kinds of issues. Also, to some extent, sexual health, of course. So it's tricky. I think on the one level, you need to make sure that there is equitable attention to people's health, whether they're men or women, and you need specialized services for different genders and ages. On the other hand, in terms of, let's say, reproductive health, as an example, childbirth and so on, you do need a relational understanding and approach to bring in partners, but as partners, and that needs to be, it's not that, men have a right to dictate that space, but it should be, figuring out what the relevant role that men has in that space is, whether it is purely as partners to support a woman to have a safe childbirth, or whether it's issues around contraception. Right. So some of those issues, I guess, and it's an issue to be vigilant on as well. Holding, if you, to the extent that you do engage men and involve men, obviously holding men to account to not distorting the primary purpose of that service or that program. I hope that answers Marina's question.
Okay, and then as a last question, we have one from Madhumita Das, who asks, who gives the example of paid work for women, ownership of land, instances where there might be an opportunity with a larger benefit not just for women but even for men within the relationship to exercise different sets of power. She's basing that on the leading or from the discussion based on Ravi's question.
Could you just rephrase that? So paid work for women, there being opportunities for men in that work. Did I get
and
that?
Also in, for example, with land ownership. So her overall question is, does it matter what the overall outcome, does the overall outcome for change matter, that where the changes are expected? So I guess she means if ownership of land for women is an opportunity which has benefit not just for women but also for men.
It's a good example of where intersectionality of economic justice and social class intersects with gender, and in that intersection it's quite obvious to see how benefits in this case, so if it is benefits for women, it can benefit their male relations quite clearly because they have a class-based solidarity or interest, let's say. It can also lead, of course, in some settings to backlash, and that's quite documented in the literature. If you have, let's say, like microcredit programs or programs targeted exclusively at empowering women with work and income, and men being, in some settings, neglected and perhaps unemployed, and you get a familiar phenomenon of backlash. Now that can be addressed by working with men in those programs in a different way, and also looking at economic realities of families in communities and individuals and couples without a kind of reductive lens that it is only individual women's empowerment that matters. But having said that, of course, there are programs needed to support individual women, and yes, there can be certainly benefits. And I think the point is to look at those intersections and to look at how communities, families, individuals can link those social justice concerns with gender justice concerns and ideas of equality and fairness in families and so on, and have open communications about that in a way that's mutually supportive. So, I mean, the case study from Bangladesh that I alluded to in the presentation is a very good example for these kinds of issues, where land ownership was also the issue, and gender justice, and how men and women can work together around that. And of course, there's a broader set of programming around economic empowerment. There's actually, if you go on the website that I showed, that board game with the 9 themes, if there's one theme on poverty and employment, and that addresses just these issues, and you can, by clicking on that, you can get to the evidence review on economic empowerment and gender equality and the role of men and boys in that. You also get to the Bangladesh case study I suggested. So on the earlier question of men's involvement in women's reproductive health, there is another theme there that you can click on. There's actually 2 themes, sexual and reproductive health and rights, and then there is basically health and well-being. Both of those themes speak to the questions raised by Marina Daniel. And you can get the case studies as well as to the chapters in the evidence review. Hopefully I've answered some of Adimita Das's question.
That's great.
It's hard to give a full and full and firm answer in a short space of time. But I'd encourage you to look up the case study and the chapter in the review about economic empowerment, poverty and employment, rather.
Thanks, Jirka, for an excellent presentation and responses to very detailed responses, thoughtful responses to many questions. These studies, these case studies done by Emerge and also the studies world over show how important it is to reframe men and boys in policy discourses. If nothing else, at least to question the gendered nature of the socioeconomic development and structural drivers that really determine a lot of development issues and problems. So in order to really address the issue of equity and to ensure that there is social justice, we must really begin to engage with men, reframe their issues, and work seamlessly at many different levels. So thank you very much. I really thank all the participants, all those who took time to participate in this learning lab, and we look forward to a continued engagement on this. The journey has just begun, I suppose.